Well, welcome to another edition of Fork in the Road. Now, unfortunately, when we're sitting down with one of the greatest of all time, and it is lethal Leigh Matthews, and I didn't want to tell him too much about his internet connection, so it is a little bit scratchy, so forgive us, but the actual audio is great. The whole interview was fantastic, and I hope you really enjoy it. Well, welcome to another edition of Fork in the Road. We've had some very big names. We've had the likes of John Daly, Ian Baker-Finch, Eddie Maguire, all the big names. But when it comes to Australian rules football, it doesn't get any bigger than this man. Now, if I read it, it would read like the Star Wars credits, all these accolades in the game of football. But Leigh Matthews, is there one accolade that sits above, even by your standards, that you're pretty chuffed about?
Probably, if you talk about an acknowledgement, I would say probably the statue at the MCG, outside the MCG. That's something that, it's a great acknowledgement. But I guess if we talk about things that I am the proudest or the happiest that have happened, it's probably being part of premierships with three clubs, Hawthorn as a player and Collingwood as a coach and the Lions as a coach. So the fact there's three separate groups of supporters that you've been able to share the biggest moment, winning a premiership, that's probably something I'm the proudest of.
The first game, Leigh, I obviously did some research for this. One thing that I was very startled about, mate, and I think you know what I might be about to say, was it didn't probably get off to the greatest of starts, that 332 game career.
Well, that was 1969. As a 17-year-old at Hawthorn, I got selected for my first game. But that was, of course, back in the days that it wasn't interchange. There was 18 players on the field and a 19th and 20th man that was like a substitute. We understand the substitute things. So I was one of them. And it was at the MCG against Melbourne. And the great Peter Hudson was a Hawthorn full forward. And he had his normal day, probably kicked 7 or 8 goals. That was pretty normal for Peter Hudson back in the day. So I think we're well in front with about 10 minutes to go. They put me on the field. So I don't remember a lot of the 800 games that I had an involvement with Corey, but I sort of still can almost feel the moment where the ball came into the forward line and Peter Hudson once didn't mark it, dropped to the front of the pack at the front of the goal square, and I grabbed it and kicked the goal. That was my one touch in my first game. But the following week I got selected in the 18, so at least I was one of the starters from there on.
And the one thing that I think, I'm not one for stats, but I think for those people out there, when I had a look into some of your big games, there were games where you would kick 7+ goals and have over 35 touches. Like there was even the famous game where you've had 41 touches. Everyone stop and think about this. You had 41 touches in a game of footy and kicked 11 goals versus Essendon. Now, Wayne Carey did have a par level, what he described for his good games, or what he said that, in my position where he said, if I had 20+ touches and kick 4 goals, that was like a bit of his par level. Now, looking at some of yours, did you have a par level for you that you thought, that's what I classify as a good game?
Strangely, it's exactly the same. I mean, I played a different position. I mean, when I was playing midfield forward, the last few years I played deep forward, so you're not going to get a lot of the ball, so it's different there. No, but as an on-ball forward, and you're on the field the whole time back in the 70s, my par performance was 20+ disposals and 4 goals. That's the way I would have thought. Okay, I played okay today. So it's strange that I've never heard that Wayne thought that as, I've always said Wayne's probably the best player I've seen, just amazing. But it just goes to show for a player that's playing forward half, for him, 20 disposals is a lot for a forward half player, isn't it? The 4 goals, full forwards average 4 goals, we know that. But I'm sort of chuffed to hear that, but it's amazing. It was exactly the same thinking about what I thought was a satisfactory game, yeah.
Well, isn't that funny? The debate rages about you two, about who is the best player ever, and quite eerily, you both had the mindset about what makes up a great game of footy.
Yeah. I mean, because back in that day, and even Wayne's in Wayne's days, say in the 90s, you didn't handball much. So if I had 20 kicks, it'd be 17 or 18 disposals, it'd be 17 or 18 kicks and just 2 or 3 handballs. And I learnt very early, Corey, you couldn't handball a goal, so I thought I'd get the handball out of my game. So no, I was kicking the ball a lot. I wasn't handballing much, but yeah, that was. And that's where they were the mindset, and we've talked about in recent times, where it's say a Patrick Dangerfield that might spend the last few years of his life playing as a permanent forward. One of the things that's really hard is that mindset. If you're a midfield player and you think, yeah, your 20 plus disposals is almost your average par game. Well, clearly, if you're playing deep forward, probably 10 disposals is a pretty good game, and being involved in some goal scoring in these days. I guess the defensive pressure aspect of playing forward, but it's sort of setting that you're always as a deep forward. I kicked 60 or 70 goals in the 2 or 3 years I played permanent forward, but I was never satisfied with that because I might have been averaging the 3 goals, but I was only averaging probably 10 disposals a game when you're used to, for most of your career, getting up into your 20s the majority of occasions.
And just on, I suppose, the likes of Wayne Carey, you had Michael Voss, and you've seen enough of these great players.
Yeah.
What do you think, and even from your mindset, what do you think it separates the great players like yourself and Wayne and Michael Voss from everyone else?
Well, I guess they're all a little bit different, but I suspect the drive to succeed and how big the drive was, how much you cared.
Yeah.
You can't measure these things, can you? But that drive and will to succeed and will to do whatever's necessary, I suppose. The end justifies the means a little bit in the way you go and played the game. I mean, I was lots closer to Michael Voss because he was captain, obviously, at the Lions, and just as an on-field midfield leader, I still think I'd probably put him first in any team I was starting to select.
Yeah.
Because I know that I've seen it, and not only the way he played like a battering ram, like just was constantly charging into the contest. Never got reported though, so he never did anything outside the rules. But he was just so strong at the football. But then his strength of mind and his leadership and his organisational skills, I mean, they were outstanding. So, but if you talk about the influence on a game just when you're watching it. Gary Ablett Senior probably influenced as many games as Wayne did, probably, but Wayne just seemed like did it more consistently, which is why I've always put him at the top of the heap when I've rated players of the 30 or 40 years, 50 years now that I've watched footy.
Yeah, and look, we both share something in common, that we both don't have a Brownlow medal.
Yeah, you got closer than I did.
But again, everyone out there, stop and have a listen to this, right? If you had 650 touches in a season, you'd think, you know what, I've had a pretty good season, averaged nearly 28 touches a game, but then rounded out with 91 goals. I would say, if I was maybe stiff that I didn't win it, but Jesus Christ, Leigh, if that's not stiff, I don't know what is.
Yeah, well, that was the 1977 year, and I guess for that the 70s decade, which I guess is the decade where I played well. There's a lot of times you are hopeful going into the Brownlow, but one of the things we know about the Brownlow is, I mean, it's voted on by the umpires.
Yeah.
The only ratings or the only criteria going into the Brownlow count, of course, is the media awards. And these days, I think umpires look at it as a generalisation, fairly similar to the outside awards. I mean, we know that this year Lachie Neale probably will win it, but we don't know. We only know that, or we only think that, because we assume the umpires will look at the games the same as the on-field observer. So yeah, 77 was the year, and I always look back. I got my hopes up really high, and I was really disappointed. I think I finished third, but I didn't vote very well. I was a long way off Graham Teasdale, who won it. And I was really disappointed after the count. And I thought, you should never be disappointed at the Brownlow. Like, go to the Brownlow and be hopeful. But of course, back in the days I played, Corey, they just actually counted the 1 votes, counted the 2 votes, then they counted the 3 votes. So they weren't done by the game. So you had no idea, for instance, what games you got votes in or didn't get votes in. That's why normally they'd shuffle the decks, and the winner would get the last 3 vote probably to win him the award. These days, when you're doing it match by match, well, everyone else can have a much more informed judgment, I guess, of how well the umpires may have got it on any particular game. But it's the official award, and I would have loved to have won one, no doubt about that, as I'm sure you would have. But it's the umpires' vote, and you got to get the most votes in any one year. The consistency doesn't really count that much.
Well, yeah, I think in today's day and age, and I think this was highlighted by many years ago now, I think when Greg Williams had that game where he had 45 touches and didn't get a vote. So I'm pretty sure with the umpires, if they were going into the rooms and they saw a bloke was having as many touches as you and kicking goals, I'm pretty sure you'd be safe to say you'd have one hanging around your neck.
Well, I'm sure back in that era, they didn't have access to stats.
Yeah.
And there's always a confusion now, isn't there? I can never quite get, do they actually, the umpires say they don't get the champion data stat sheets, after the game, but they may look at the scoreboard at 3/4 time, so get some idea who's been getting the big numbers. So I must say, I've never been able to get to, do they actually know the stats, or is it totally on their own judgment? But I think now when there's 3 umpires and the 3 umpires are going to discuss it, even the other boundary umpires, goal umpires may have a view, but it's a little group now, a group decision, not an individual umpire, which it would have been 50 years ago.
Yeah. And just with Hawthorn, I've always been sort of curious from the outside. What was the thing that made Hawthorn that like with that culture at Hawthorn, like the Hawthorn way that gets spoken about? How can you put it into words for everyone out there about what really makes that Hawthorn way?
Well, back when I went to Hawthorn in the late 60s, I mean, the senior coach was always the sort of the dominant figure. And John Kennedy Senior, who obviously he passed away this year, if ever there's one man that can be the basis of a club culture, I think he's it. He's a fantastic example. And that was around, I mean, remember back up into playing football as a job, that started in the 90s. So before that, it was like a community footy club when you think of it, the VFL days where you 12 clubs in Melbourne, but you go and train a couple of nights a week and then you turn up Saturday. Half the time you turn up at the ground, you wouldn't even know exactly what position you were playing. I mean, it was almost like some suburban clubs would be preparing better than clubs back in that era. So the senior coach and their attitude to things are the things that probably are the most powerful influences on what the group thinks. And John Kennedy, and it wasn't about how to play football, but it was how to compete. The team always come first. And I always think when I coach that, ultimately players individually, I mean, it's their career. They're selfish about wanting to achieve in their career. But John Kennedy taught us to invest in the team cause, because that's the way it is. You want to be part of a team sport, you've got to be prepared to invest in the team's success. And it was like a culture. He lived it, totally lived it. And I think that sort of spread into everyone around Hawthorn. No matter how big your ego was at Hawthorn, you had to hide the ego best you could, because the team interest always came first. And that came from John Kennedy, being humble in victory, savage in defeat, all those kind of things. But he was so big at Hawthorn in the 60s and 70s. But I think even now, that influence that he, in a sense, started with a few other people, I gather, but in that period of time, has tended to have stayed fairly solid at Hawthorn for the many generations since John was directly involved.
And when you mention it like that, Leigh, it would be probably the only way you could manage all those personalities at Hawthorn, because you think around, like, if I think like sort of even 83, 84, you got the likes of Dermott, yourself,
Yep.
I mean, Dipper, all these huge personalities.
Yeah.
It's probably, it really says a lot about the Hawthorn culture, that it kept everyone, it didn't matter how big their personality was. Yes, you could have a personality, but at the end of the day, they knew the set code of behaviour.
Yeah, absolutely. During the 70s and 80s, you had John Kennedy initially, then David Parkin, and then Alan Jeans for most of the 80s. I mean, these are icons of the coaching industry. So I was so lucky to play under all those all those three. I mean, the zoning which came into the Victorian League in 1960, the zoning was very good to Hawthorn. A lot of players that came from the Morton Peninsula and Gippsland. So a lot of talent came into club at that period of time. But to get the best out of the talent, yeah, you had some really, really powerful senior coaches, when really we know now that coaching is a group activity. And what the senior coach used to do in the 70s and 80s is probably spread amongst like 10 assistant coaches in modern footy. But back then it was one person doing 95% of the coaching. So I think Hawthorn had three absolute icons of the coaching industry for that in the 70s and 80s, which is, you could argue that, I guess, about Alistair Clark's in the modern era, but certainly in that formative era when football was going from sort of amateur part-time to professionalism, the VFL was becoming the AFL, when there was so much change happening.
And one thing, you mentioned about Alan Jeans. I know post what had happened with Neville Bruns, the strength of Alan Jeans, I think he came around your house and he had some pretty good words of wisdom at that time.
We did actually, yeah. I mean, that was a pretty terrible memory. I did the crime, so you got to do the time. So that particular incident is one you'd like the moment back. And once the moment happens, then you've done the damage, you're the villain rightly, and therefore the repercussions. But the thing that's the biggest repercussion is the guilt. To be honest, you just think, what did I do that for? I mean, that was just a shocking thing to do. And I was late in my career anyway. That 85 was going to be my last year. And I remember Alan Jeans coming round to my house on that Sunday afternoon following. And he said to me, because it's a bit like, which I don't know, I don't know whether I can go out there again, because I just feel so, so guilt-ridden. And he said to me, he said, don't let this be the last moment of your playing career. And that was probably a pretty profound thought. That and profound in a lot of ways. Okay, it was a bad moment. You got to live through it. You got to take the repercussions, and then you got to move on. And I guess that was that was Alan's way of saying that.
And I have a question from Kenny Ward, who's chairman of the Woodsmen at Collingwood. He's asking who you would have given out some fairly solid hits yourself, but who was the person that nailed Leigh Matthews that you went, holy shit, they actually got me good and proper there?
Well, I was lucky. I think there was only two times where I was actually knocked out, and one of them was Collingwood at Victoria Park, when Stan Magro, I don't even know quite how it all happened, but it was a collision with Stan Magro, and that sort of pretty much knocked me out. My back never touched a stretcher, Corey, I've got to say that, but they walked me off the field. But the worst one I've ever had, I think, was in a state game when Victoria played South Australia. It was my last state game, actually, 1982. And I think Ivan Eckerman was a South Australian player. I basically more ran into him, but my head thumped into his hip bone, I'm pretty sure. And that was where I lost a minute or so. And I kind of remember just all of a sudden being like in the fog and hearing the crowd noise, and the trainers were walking me around the boundary line, off the ground. So I think they were the two heaviest hits I guess I had.
And on to one of my favourite topics. I was a big Collingwood fan as a kid. What was it like coming from Hawthorn and coming across to arguably the most famous club in the comp?
Yeah. Well, the first thing was actually going to Victoria Park to work and not breaking into a cold sweat. I can tell you, as an opposition player, playing at Victoria Park was the worst possible experience. I mean, it felt like that ground was so hostile, you almost didn't want to go near the boundary line. So joining the Collingwood army, I guess, was the first thing I had to get over. Well, when I finished playing, there was no role for me at Hawthorn, so I was initially asked to go to Collingwood to be an assistant coach, a full-time assistant coach, when really Bob Rose, the senior coach, was still had a business working a job, and the idea was to become coach at the end of 1986, at the end of that first year. But there's a lot of upheaval at Collingwood early in that season. We lost the first 3 games. I think financially the club was almost bankrupt, and in a whole lot of changes to enable the club to continue. Alan McAllister became chairman, John Bird, I'm pretty sure it was, became CEO initially for a short period of time. Graham Allen became football manager, and I became senior coach. So that all happened in a couple of days, the Monday, Tuesday of the week after round 3. So it was a lot of upheaval at Collingwood at the time. I didn't expect that when I went to Collingwood, that all of a sudden the club was virtually bankrupt and out of business. But that was the start off. I think pretty quickly, your allegiances. We're not like footy fans. When you play and coach, you very quickly, whoever you're serving, that's who you're loyal to. That's where your allegiance lies. And footy fans don't do that. They don't change clubs willy-nilly. But as someone who has changed clubs 3 times and being part of Collingwood for a decade, I mean, that's the epicenter of your life. You got to realise what everyone says, that the Herald Sun is virtually the Collingwood newsletter. That sometimes there'd be a back page story on the Herald Sun that you thought, that's pretty insignificant. But then go to the back page of the Herald Sun. So it was always exciting because they mostly still played at Victoria Park in my coaching era. Started to shift to the MCG later in my decade. And then, of course, when we got over the line in the 1990 grand final, and you can share the moment with the hundreds of thousands of Collingwood supporters, particularly when they'd had a few decades of being good, keep getting to the grand finals, but just couldn't quite get over the line on the final day. I mean, it made it even better because the Collywobbles thing surrounding that premiership probably made it even sweeter.
Now, I told you last week when I saw you at the luncheon, I did speak to Sean Mullane, and one of the things that he said that he'd found not too recently, he said he'd found some notes that Darren had written, and I think this relates back to the first final. I don't think this is very well known, but it relates back to the first final. You put Darren through a similar fitness test to what you would then do to Alan Richardson. Was that on the eve of the first finals, trying to test his thumb out?
Well, yes, the story of that one. So we were second on the ladder leading into the 1990 final series, and in the second last game, Darren Mullane broke his thumb, like badly. So much that it was going to be in plaster, and it would be in plaster 5 or 6 weeks. That would be the end of his season. But he had a strong mind. Not only had a strong body, he had a strong mind, and he actually went and saw the orthopaedic surgeon who worked for Collingwood, John Bartlett. And he asked John, he said, listen, if I took it out of plaster and you strapped it up heavily and injected the painkillers, do you think there's some chance I might be able to get away with it, get away with playing? And John said, well, let's give it a go. Well, I guess one of the things as coach, one thing you have to, virtually we were going into the last game of the season, so you could sort of probably experiment a little bit. So it was a hand injury. So he could run. What he couldn't do was probably handle. He almost was playing with half a hand, if you could understand that. And I gave him a fitness test just to see that it looked like he could handle the ball a little bit. And it was enough in that fitness test to actually play the final game, which he did. Played the final game. And Darren was a very confident man, very confident player. And often he would try things that I thought were low percentage in a way, because he had enormous confidence in himself. But for that 5 weeks, a couple of things happened. He actually, every week, he would inject himself up. Post-game, he was in agony. So for 5 consecutive weeks, he knew the post-game agony was going to come when the painkillers wear off, but he knew he was going to put him through that discomfort. But on the field, he played with a discipline of knowing, okay, there's only certain things I can do, so I won't try and go outside that. Like, don't try and jump on a pack and take a big mark, because his hands weren't working well enough to do that. So he became an inspiration to the team because of that, the pain they knew he was prepared to put himself through, and an inspiration to the team because of the manner in which he played those games. He was still enormously valuable playing footy with a broken hand. It might not have felt the pain, but he had very little grip and movement. So it was an amazing thing to observe. Amazing.
Yeah, and then there was obviously the famous quarter time brawl. I know you've mentioned, and I've heard the story a number of times, that you come in at quarter time, everyone's fired up, and you got Mullane and Kelly and these sort of blokes, their eyes are rolling, and so it was really the words that you then had to the players and trying to calm them down at that time.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was the wildest scene I've ever seen on a football field. I mean, the officials were fighting in one part of the ground, the players were fighting over the other side of the ground. It was quarter time, so the umpires couldn't break it up. It was chaos. So you can imagine that when finally the playing groups came together, but I mean, then it gets back to what's my job in a way. It's a bit like saying the logical thing. Well, okay, Gavin Brown had been sort of knocked out in a sense. Do we seek revenge for him, or do we want to win the game? And I think the answer was pretty clear. Gavin would want us to win the game. So how do we win the game? Well, we win the game by keeping our eyes on the footy harder than you normally would, because we all know that, don't we? When the game gets a little bit wild, umpires have to reassert control. And it was only, I mean, that I'm sure Kevin Chitty probably said the same words to Essendon, but somehow or other our players were able to go out and keep their eye on the football, and we got a couple of 50-metre penalties and got 5 goals, I think, in that second quarter that got us the break. So, yeah, that's you never know what's going to happen on a footy field. No one could have prepared for that, clearly. But, yeah, for our players' ability to reset their focus on what they had to do to give us the best chance of winning, that was clearly very important.
And I know you've mentioned this before, but the Monkhurst goal in the last quarter must have been, is that up there with nearly your favourite football memories of all time?
Well, I always think to myself, Corey, like you can't remember a lot of footy, but you always remember if you're in grand finals and you're lucky enough to be in the grand final, at what point do you think we've won? I can almost name them. In 71, we were 7 points in front, the siren went. So it was a siren. 76, we might have been 3 goals in front. So it was almost down to the siren. 78 was a few goals. It was almost down to the siren. 83, we were 78 points in front at 3/4 time on that one against Essendon. So I remember walking from the break, and there was no euphoria in a way, because long way out from the siren, you knew you couldn't lose. We were 13 goals in front. And you can almost remember the siren in 84. I can almost go through them. 85, we were gone at 3/4 time in a way. So you go into 1990. So the moment, late in the game, we didn't have the countdown clock in the coach's box. That was the count up clock. It was about the 28-minute mark. I think it was 7 goals in front. Most people would have thought we were going to win, but not me. It's the moment where you can't lose. Not you're probably going to win. The moment you can't lose. And Tony Shaw played an incredible game that day, won the Norm Smith medal, and was just outstanding. He popped a little short kick from the forward flank into Damien Monkhurst, about 40 metres out, and Big Monkey, the big 200-centimetre blonde ruckman, went back and kicked the goal. And we're now 8 goals in front, about the 29-minute mark of the last quarter. I figure we cannot lose now. And that moment is the best. I mean, you know, where you've experienced them, you can probably empathise at what point in your premierships did you think, you know, we've won it. A close game, it might be the siren, or there just might be a moment sometime in the last quarter when, you know, when it comes into your mind. But that's why that moment in 1990 for the whole Collingwood history, I suppose, and I guess my first time as coach, that was the moment where I thought we can't lose now, was just the best.
And for those people that don't know, I know that you've, what's the theory that you've got, that it's if you're up by more goals than minutes?
Well, that's my coaching box theory. When I'm in the coaching box, I always thought I only relaxed a little bit if we were more goals in front than minutes to go. So that's sort of become a little bit spoken about in, because I might have mentioned that on some of the media stuff that I've done, but it was really a very pessimistic coach who was never comfortable until you couldn't lose. And the couldn't lose was, like, if you're 4 goals in front with 3 minutes to play, you're going to win probably 99% of the time, aren't you, really? But if you're sort of 5 goals in front with 6 minutes to go, stuff like that. But it's just a little formula that I had in my mind as a pessimistic coach in the coach's box.
This episode is brought to you by National Make Good Solutions, experts in taking your commercial property back to the day it was built at the end of your lease. Now, on to the Lions, but you'd obviously had a little bit of time away from the commentary box, and even I know I've heard you say that you changed the message a little bit, where you became a little bit more positive But and you know the question I did ask you last week at a function, but I just think it's what you actually ended up doing. And I know I'm not, no disrespect to you guys, but having Phil Jauncey and the process that you guys came up with, I know that Richmond are doing a lot of stuff with Emma Murray now, which is about mindfulness, but it's in that same sort of space. But I think just give everyone an insight, because I think it was such a valuable tool for the Brisbane Lions, especially, again, you look at all the different personalities you had in your team, and also probably giving you a really good framework to then coach them.
Yeah, Phil Jauncey was our sports psychologist, has done a lot of work with a lot of Queensland sports team and Australian cricket team. And one of the things that he's really good at, well, he's good at two things. He's a sports psychologist who says we can't care what you think, we can only care what you actually do. I think that's a pretty good lesson. I don't get it around this thing that I didn't feel like doing it, so I didn't do it. Like, discipline is doing the right thing at the right time. So Phil was always pushed that point. But one of the other things he was really good at is actually he had a personality profiling system that was his own. Like, it was a questionnaire that only took 15 minutes to answer, maybe 40 questions, A, B, C, D, which sort of is the way you think it. It actually tended to spit out just a basic personality tendencies. And as Phil said all the time, these are tendencies. No, they're no excuse for doing the wrong thing at the wrong time, because that's my tendency. And there was four characteristics: the mozzie, the really buzzy, excitable sort of type of part of our personality; the enforcer, which is goal-driven, goal-setting, personal responsibility part of you; the thinker, the rationalising part of you; and the feeler, which is we all feel things at different times. And everybody's got a certain percentage of that within them. And we did that very public. It was the whole club, let alone the players, all knew the basic personality profile of each other. And that helped us understand the tendencies of ourselves. Like, for instance, being a heavy enforcer, thinker, I had total ownership of what the team was doing. So if one of my players came to me with a suggestion that was different to what we're already doing, there was, like, the enforcer part of me would say, he's trying to change my plan. But knowing that about myself, I learned to sort of shut up, because you felt like you had to protect your plan. Because then if you don't allow the player to express what he's thinking, or don't encourage him to express what he's thinking, he's not come back next time. It's too much mature. But then the thinker part of me would think about what he spoke about. And if it was going to help the team, hey, we're doing it. So it's knowing yourself was more as important as actually knowing those around you. So therefore you had a little bit more of a head start. And it's only a head start probably. I mean, Alan Jeans, who I mentioned was my third coach at Hawthorn, he was the best sports psychologist that I've ever had anything to do with. And he had never done any training in psychology, but he knew people. He knew how to press the right buttons. I was always a little bit overweight, so Gigi just come up to me and just pinched my belly, just to say, "Yeah, how's your weight going?" Things like that, without saying a word. And anyway, but this helped enormously with the way we operated. We even did it with the wives' girlfriends, like the partners and the staff around the place. So we understood what were the tendencies of all the people that we might deal with. Phil could probably run off the verbatim the tendencies of about 80 people. I almost had to refer to the list for a lot of. But I think it was a really helpful way, and I think it's probably not quite the mindfulness thing we talk here about now. I'm not sure exactly what that entails. It's much more probably about empathy, I guess.
Yeah.
Vulnerability. This was more about just understanding and Phil always used to say that under pressure you tend to go to your tendencies, and that's not necessarily a good thing. So if you're and he used to talk about flags, which were just little markers that if you all of a sudden you thought you were sort of straying into a place which was going to be negative. Yeah, so very valuable. He was a really, really valuable coaching assistant to me in my my time at the Lions.
And when I look back at it, I know that everyone makes a lot of the famous "if it bleeds, we can kill it" type thing. Yeah. But do you think that was a real fork in the road moment for the Lions, because it really signalled that, hey, we belong and we can really take on the best teams of the competition, especially at that time, the all-conquering Essendon?
Yeah. It was certainly a fork in the road, and it seems that your program, the fork in the road, because we're going in fork in the roads all the time. When we look back, there's forks in the road, crossroads moments, sliding door moments happening all the time, and that situation. I think we were in. I'm trying to think of the exact numbers. I think it was 4 wins, 4 losses. We went to Melbourne to play Carlton, and in 2001 this was, and Carlton beat us by 80 points. Absolutely thrashed us. And in the review, one of the things that really we were able to emphasise in that review is that Carlton had sort of Bradley and Koutafidis and Ratton, some star players, but they had Freeborn and Hume and Franchina, who were the taggers, stoppers type players, who enabled the stars to be stars.
Yeah.
And I think we were able to highlight that role-playing mantra that okay, we to be a good team, you've got to be prepared to accept your role, to know it, accept it, perform it, and we'll acknowledge you for it too. I mean, that's part of the process. So I think I felt like as a coach, you're saying that type of mantra over and over again, but somehow or other the light bulb moment, I think, popped into our players a little bit, and we got beaten briefly by a small margin the following week against the Crows. So we're now 4 wins, 6 losses. Now this is what we're playing Essendon, who had hardly lost for a couple of years. And the Blues, you can kill it, was only just a little bit of a theme of, okay, they're not invincible, and that was from the Predator, the Arnie Schwarzenegger movie. But the thing that I think the players really engrossed that week was not so much that theme. That was really just, something we look back on it now, and anything. Coaches are doing themes every second week, aren't they? And sometimes if you win, they sort of get remembered. If they lose, no one ever thinks of them again. But the role-playing mantra and basically, one of the things that Alistair Lynch often talks about, as a coach, you're not sure what players are taking in, but that we did an exercise where we put our team up against their team, where it was experienced as Essendon were in games played. And it was like an Alistair Lynch was the core of this. It was Lynchy, well, what we want you to do, you're playing full forward. We want to be able to be confident that we can bomb the ball into you 10 or 15 metres out. You got to try and mark it if you can, but definitely don't get marked against, and make sure it comes to the front. And Craig McRae was our main small forward. You make sure you're in that crumbing position at the front of Lynchy. That was an example of the role playing, and the players have accepted their role playing, mantra. And when the Lions Premiership players look back on that era, mostly that's the thing that they tend to mention, that we learned to play our roles. We were prepared to play our roles, accepted the role, and we got home against Essendon that week, and that started the 20-game winning run. I mean, when we'd been beaten by Carlton 2 weeks earlier by 80 points, I tell you what, we were a long way off winning 20 straight games. So quite amazing how the turnaround that happened. I guess we didn't win 20 games, obviously beating Essendon, but that was the start of what that run. And the other thing I think the players talk about, Corey, is living in the moment. That basic challenge of living in the moment. That okay, if we won last week, we learn from it, move on. If we lost last week, we learn what we can and move on. And this week's the most important game we'll ever play. I mean, I think that's what the team built on after that Essendon win.
You find most of like you talk about an unexpected gem that comes out of, by the sound of it, was out of a lot of your best learnings out of occasions like that where in the end you'd been beaten. Like, and that then what happened after that? Yes, I know it's a famous if it bleeds we can kill it, but really the seeds were sown in the learnings out of that Carlton game.
Yeah, well, I believe so, and the learning of actually the role playing. That's the point. Yeah. And I think probably every coach is saying that to every team, that you got to play your role. This is what we'd like you to do, and this is you got to try and play. But that seemed like a foundation thought that was pretty much part of the Lions team that was pretty successful thereafter. And I guess I mean, that the thing is, and this is the thing that people, I mean, you play a game, whether you play or coach, when you think of it, when you play or coach, you have an emotional response after the game. If you win, and you play well, you might feel good about yourself. As a coach, as soon as the siren goes, you walk down from the coach's box thinking, what am I going to say to the team to start next week's campaign? That's different with playing and coaching. but you still have an emotional response. I mean, coaches always feel responsible because that's a job. You're supposed to feel responsible. But by about lunchtime the following day, all of a sudden the emotional response starts to fade, and you start thinking about, now what are we going to do from now on? Like if there's a coach, what are we going to do for training this week? Who might I thought, what's alterations to the team? All things about what are we going to do going forward. But I was always a strong believer that you have to leave that emotional response sit there. Not for more than a day, but certainly for a period of time, because I don't know about you, but I've always thought the pain of losing was much more in depth than the joy of winning. But either way, I've always thought if you're a good loser, you don't win much.
Yeah, that's right. Now, another part, and it was on the back of those other fitness tests, but speaking of famous fitness tests, with Lappin before the grand finals, like what's it like for a coach knowing that you're either going to make someone's dream come true or potentially you might crush it, but you know that it has to happen?
I probably found that part easy. I mean, I wanted Nigel Lappin to be available because he was such a good player. I wanted him in the team.
Yeah.
But he late in the preliminary final, he got a knee in his ribs and had cracked his ribs, not just in one spot. It was almost his whole rib cage had a few fractures in it. And somehow or other, the pain management, our medical team, which were really innovative at the time, I remember they went to the Wesley Pain Management Centre to work out how could we actually manage the pain, because obviously the ribs are not a moving part. That's one thing. You couldn't do it with a leg injury, could you? But if we can stop the pain, he should be okay. Might be able to play. So they gave that a go. But the last thing you can do as a coach, I mean, my job is what's in the best interest of the team, not what is in Nigel's best interest. So Nigel had to be you had to break down in the fitness test, not the game. Now I had a completely clear conscience with that, and I think all the players and Nigel himself will even expect that. The last thing you can do is put a player on a field where you don't, he doesn't know he's right, you don't know he's right, and he breaks down early in the game. Then you've really failed. I mean, that can happen, I know, with muscular injuries. So he had a a brutal fitness test, because it had to be a physical one. He had to prove that he could take contact and not, and be okay. And so they needled him up on the Friday afternoon before the grand final, and he seemed to survive that. I didn't really know until even later on. He had a very sleepless night because I'm pretty sure that he actually suffered a punctured lung in the fitness test because he was in pain all night. He didn't. Then with about 3/4 an hour before the game, really, and the team sheets had to be in 40 minutes before the game for this particular year in 2003. And Nigel, he had been injected up, and he couldn't feel the pain, but he sort of said to me, "My problem is I don't feel like I can take deep breaths," which I think is the punctured lung. And anyway, so it was like, it was. I remember Peter Stanton, who was our physio, he said, with Nigel, he's got to make the choice. He's eventually either got to say, I'm okay, I'm prepared to give it a go, or no, I'm not. And the clock was ticking. It was probably 2 or 3 minutes before the team sheet had to be in. And everyone was uncertain. Chris Scott was actually already changed. He was going to be the replacement. But then Nigel, I just brought him in the coach's room and said, okay, we're going to make a decision. He said, yeah, I think I'm okay. And we did it. I mean, I look back at that with a bit of terror in me, to be honest, because you think what you know now, and putting him out there. I mean, it was incredible risk when you think of it.
Yeah.
And we won. Nigel got through, and we won. But I guess, to be honest, there's a lot of risks like that being taken on grand final day, Corey. Probably a lot of years where the power of the mind can be amazing. And I reckon grand final day is where the power of the mind can sometimes override a nasty physical problem. Like you can will yourself somehow or other. I mean, Anthony Stevens was one that did that in your era, didn't he? I think 1 year. Steve Johnson maybe 1 year at Geelong. So I think there was an element of that. I know Jonathan Brown played in the 2003 grand final, 2004, sorry, with a knee joint deadened. Michael Voss did in 2003 with a deadened knee joint. Of course, it had been sore. So a lot of things happen on grand final day that would never happen any other time. But I know if we'd lost that day and this story had come out, we as a coaching staff, as an off-field operation, would have been crucified.
Do you think was that at the back of your mind that maybe after the Alan Richardson fitness test, or that you had maybe a little bit more empathy, because that is super, super close to the bone, like given that late to actually prove his fitness?
Well, it was, as I say, Alan Richardson, which was in my Collingwood days, he cracked his collarbone in the second semi-final, and then on the Thursday, about what would have been 12 days later, when we were training, he seemed to be moving okay. But I thought, this is not possible. This is not, because as soon as you get a few belts on it, clearly, if you've got a cracked collarbone, and that's a moving part, that's the difference. Look, the ribs aren't a moving part as long as they're not too painful.
Yeah.
The shoulder and your moving part, you can't play with that active. So the same principle, I guess. I was a bit younger in that period. It was only 5 years post-playing. So I did a little bit of the physical stuff with Alan Richardson. And he actually, in fact, he got through the fitness test on the Thursday night. But he came in on the Friday morning and said, no, it's sore. So I know it's not right. He knew it wasn't right. So he basically, we didn't have to actually do the final fitness test on the Friday. But I guess my basic attitude to all that is that you basically... You got to know you're physically right, or you're physically, mentally right enough to be able to survive and be a contributor. Darren Mullane, good example. You knew he only had sort of half a hand in a sense, but he still could be a valuable contributor. But if they get knocked out of the game, and all of a sudden you're a man short, well, that's a punt that probably I think we've all taken over time. But anyway, you do what the advice is at the time.
And a very funny story that I've heard about post 2003 grand final with you and Justin Lepich in the lift. So how did that unfold for people that are out there? I know that he was talking himself up, and I know that you might fired back with a little bit of a zinger.
Yeah, a little bit of fun. Well, this was about 4 hours after the premiership, and I'm not much of a drinker, but I reckon 4 hours after the grand final, I must have had about eight Crown Lagers, so I had plenty of alcohol on board, and the whole team was in the freight elevator going up to the function at I think it was the Crown, the convention centre at Crown. Everyone was mucking around and having fun. I got to preempt it with this, because this is the situation. But everyone was having fun, and they said, Lepper said, Leigh, where would you be without us? And I said, Lepper, probably just a player of the century, mate. That's all. So it was just one of those fun things, but it was one of those little bit of mythical things that actually happened at the time. Yeah.
And I know, look, coaches don't like to play favourites, but looking back at your coaching career, both at Collingwood and Brisbane, who was the one player that you thought, gee, I'm pretty blessed to have this bloke?
We spoke about Michael Voss earlier on. I mean, to be a premiership seed, clearly you need a lot of good players. I mean, Wayne Carey was a good player, but you had a lot of other good players for North to win the premiership in the 90s. I mean, it's funny. I always think that the great blessing I had as coach was I thought Tony Shaw was an outstanding leader of men. He was tough. He was physically, mentally tough, and a great leader of men. So he was fantastic to have as captain of the Collingwood side for the majority of the time I coached Collingwood. And the same at Brisbane. I think Michael Voss was probably a physically better player, but they were so strong mentally. I mean, they were such competitors and got the best out of themselves all the time. So the leader of the team tends to be, I guess, usually not used to be the best player, I suppose. But ultimately, it's the guy that actually, if we all did this, would we be better off for it? Which individual kind of tends to be the character, that characteristic? And you can only have the best available, can't you? The best of your playing list becomes captain. But I thought Shorey and Michael Voss were just such outstanding captains, leaders of men that I think a coach always tends to think his captain is his representative on the field in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, now with leadership groups, it's not just the captain; it's a greater spread, and probably even was, say, in the Lions days. Not so in the Collingwood days, the captain was probably, in a sense, even more so the representative of the field. So, no, the great blessing is to coach those two men.
Now, we haven't got too long to go, Leigh. I sincerely appreciate sitting down and having a chat. Now, the preview, the two games this weekend. Now, I am going to read this quote because I think it's very relevant for the teams that are going into the weekend. I think of this quote that you said about George Patton about accept the challenge without reservation or doubt and risk the depression of losing so you may experience the exhilaration of victory. So for these four teams that are left, I think that quote that I've heard you say is a very apt quote.
Well, that's what we do. I mean, anyone who goes and competes, that's what you do, don't you? I mean, you got to accept the challenge of doing your absolute best, everything you can do to actually have the euphoria of exhilaration of victory. But as I said earlier, you still lose a lot, so that's a distinct possibility. But putting yourself on the line, I think, with all the things come with it, is one of those, I think, those critical factors. Yeah, that was a quote that was sent to me by a well-meaning Collingwood supporter way back at the start of the 1990 final series. It always sticks with me because I always think to myself, in a nutshell, that's what you're doing. You're accepting the challenge. If you don't want to accept the challenge, don't be involved. But if you want to compete in compete at any level, but let alone at elite level, that's the two outcomes. Grand final day, I always think, you get to grand final day, which is what this week is all about, isn't it? That's the cruelest day on the footy calendar because, the end of the day on grand final day, the difference between what the winning team feels and what the losing team feels is just dramatic, isn't it? We've all experienced both. So accepting the challenge and putting yourself on the line, I mean, that's the basis of having a go, isn't it?
And just a tip, so we got Port and Richmond tonight. What's the thoughts with that one?
I think I'm still sticking with Richmond because I sort of still think probably they got the best upper level, and I guess you can only tip on the basis that four teams are going to play at their absolute best. I think if Richmond play at their absolute best, I still think they're most likely to win. But to me, it's a 50-50 game, and so is the other one, to be honest, with Brisbane and Geelong. That's a 50-50 game. I'm leaning to Brisbane. I mean, they've got the home state advantage. Geelong was so good last week. That's almost a slight negative to this week because it's very hard to be at that unbelievable level they were in the first half last week and repeat it. And I just think the big Oscar McInerney, the big ruckman for the Lions, who's 204 centimetres, got a really big reach. I've got a feeling, it's one thing, as you know, in modern footy, the ruckman can get the hit outs, but it doesn't have a lot to do with ground level clearances a lot of the time. Didn't last week in the Geelong Collingwood game, but Oscar's got a really big reach. And I think he's got a pretty good chance of being able to hit the ball into creative space. And that's the one little factor that makes me lean towards the Lions.
And you would never have thought, Leigh, in your wildest dreams, when you came up here 20 years ago, I'm fortunate to live in Queensland now myself. And what would it mean for Queensland, from where you've seen where football had been to where it is now, and then maybe fingers crossed without us both being biased from a Lions point of view, but it will be pretty special if the Lions can not only play in the grand final, but if they can actually win it.
Oh, absolutely. If the home team have a chance to be playing at the Gabba next week, that's going to really make it even bigger, isn't it? In Queensland. We wouldn't have thought this 6 months ago, or even 3 months ago, probably, Corey. I mean, this is an unusual year, as we know. One of my favourite weeks in being in Melbourne, even though I've been up here 20 years, I'm still in Melbourne most of grand final week and grand final day around the MCG. It's incredible because it's developed over the decades, hasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the decision this year to have it at the Gabba was made the start of September, so it's different. I think of the word boutique. This is a boutique grand final. Like, it's going to be smaller, clearly, but it's going to be special and it's going to be unique. Now, what it does to the big picture of AFL in Queensland, I'm not as strong on that as a lot of people are, that because we're going to have the grand final up here, all of a sudden, every second rugby league person is going to swap over to AFL. Don't think that's going to happen, because you've only got to live up in this part of the world to think to yourself, AFL up here has been a little bit like rugby league in Melbourne. Melbourne Storm have been an outstanding rugby league team, haven't they? But rugby league hasn't really got hold of Melbourne, I wouldn't have thought. So but that's not the point. This is a unique year. The fact is that it looked like there might not have been a competition to play, let alone finals to play, and it'll still be an outstanding game. And the marketer's dream for me, Corey, is the Lions playing Richmond, like the established champs versus the home team challengers. That'd be the marketer's dream.
Yeah, it would be. Now, only a couple of questions to go. One that I always ask everyone, your fork in the road moment for Leigh Matthews. I'm curious to know, where's the moment, and you may have had several fork in the roads over your career, or it could be early on in your career, but where was the moment that things could have gone either way, but hopefully they then went for the positive?
There's fork in the road. Well, I mean, I guess the most recent one for me is, I was a Melbourne boy, born and bred. I'd shifted about 15 kilometres in my whole life, in the southern suburbs there. I finished at Collingwood in 95, did some media for 3 years. Thought, well, that's the finish. I finished my time at club level. And of course, Brisbane asked me to come up to coach, and big decision to shift to a couple of thousand k's to somewhere I'd never lived before. So, initially when I started speaking to them, it was only out of courtesy. But over a few weeks, all of a sudden I thought to myself, "Yep, okay, it's time to give this a go, accept the challenge," to use that terminology. So I guess that was a fork in the road, and I've been up here 20 years, and I most probably would spend the rest of my life up here, I would have thought. So yeah, that was probably the biggest fork in the road for me.
Just on that, and one thing now that I've been up here, and I probably always even thought this as a player, do you feel like the Lions have actually got a pretty good advantage by playing their footy in Queensland? And the reason why I say that is you've only got a 2-hour flight to most of the venues. Mm. And when you come home to here, you come home to Queensland, middle of winter, it's 22, 23 degrees. It's pretty good on your body.
No doubt about that. I mean, it's been out of the footy heartland, and traditionally most players want to play at the MCG every second week. I mean, why wouldn't you? Yeah. But I think with the advent of a lot of the social media and the scrutiny on players, I think some players are thinking being a little bit outside the big AFL bubble is not such a bad thing. But the point you're mentioning, this climate. I mean, we put up with the summer humidity a little bit. So I'm not big on that, to be honest. I don't think that's necessarily great for athletes. But from sort of April through to September, I mean, as you said, it's a beautiful winters up here. So in terms of being able to sort of get the best out of your physical, out of yourself, I think that is an advantage. Been a big advantage this year because the Lions have largely, apart from maybe 3 weeks where they were in Sydney, they've been virtually playing out of their home, playing out of their home beds, I guess. So that's helped them this year, and that'll help them in the grand final if they get that far. But the winter climate up here, you probably get used to it, but it is pretty special.
Yeah, it is. Now, one last question. You've pretty much done everything in the game as a player, coach, commentator, whether it be father, grandfather. Do you feel what else is still to come for Leigh Matthews? Like, what else is there still to achieve on that in life?
Well, I guess sort of right at the moment, I'm sort of retired in that sense, I guess. I'm not putting myself on the line anymore. I mean, I got to finish coaching in 2008, and that was partly why I thought I was mid-50s. At that point in time, I accepted the challenge of the footy weekends. Where your life's going to change after every game you play or coach. I mean, that's what it's like, isn't it? Really, when you're in the middle of it. So I decided a decade ago, so not to do that any longer. So I don't do anything that extremely challenges me emotionally these days. I mean, I like going to the footy. I do the media stuff, so talking about the footy, but you don't have that emotional up or downer that comes from being involved at club level. So I think that part of my life it's probably gone, and I miss it. I was down just the local shops the middle of the week, and Eric Hipwood, who lives in these suburbs, and they're allowed to go out and get a coffee, but they're not allowed to come close to people. So I spoke to him from a few metres away, and I thought to myself, I'd love to be an Eric Hipwood, because as we know, isn't it, the pressure and the tension and all that kind of stuff, that might not be so good, but the stimulation, the excitement and the anticipation. So I don't get either of them now. I don't get the extreme, the pressure, and I don't get the stimulation, particularly when you get to a finals campaign. I thought to myself, I love that churning in my guts where you think, oh, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but there's an excitement building within you. But I think I've left that behind, Corey, from this part of my existence.
Isn't it funny? It's horrible at the time on game day, and you having that churning in your guts, but you give anything to have it back.
Even that nice achy feeling you get the day after a game. It's a familiar achy feeling, isn't it? When you're just a little bit bruised and beaten up. I miss that because that was something you look back on as something that was familiar, wasn't it? It was a familiar part of your footy cycle. That stiffness and soreness after a game.
Now, Leigh, it's been absolutely fantastic to sit down with you for an hour or so. I know for those that are watching it, it's I know the maybe the reception's a little bit scratchy, but I know the audio is absolutely perfect. But from a personal point of view, it is an honour. I don't know whether you can see it up behind me. It takes pride of place. I haven't got a bloody Brownlow, but I'll tell you what I have got. I have got a Leigh Matthews trophy, and that for me means the world to me.
Yeah.
And whenever we've crossed paths, I remember I would have been down in Brighton. I'm forever grateful. You've always had a lot of time for me. And anytime I get the opportunity to sit down with you and talk footy and get an insight into what is made one of the great players of all time, it's always a privilege. So I appreciate you taking the time out, and maybe go Lions.
It's been a pleasure, Corey. Thank you.
Thanks, mate.